Thank you very much for being here. It's the last meeting that we have for this year's webinar series, Ethnografein. So we're reaching the end of this long journey in the Eurasian region. And I think this last meeting postulates what we could trying to. So it's the it postulates how Eurasia is not really a territorial region, but a geopolitical one. That's why we're traveling beyond the traditional limits of the continent, if you like, and we are reaching India and Africa today. We have two very interesting presenters and presentations. The first one is Elisa Scalisi, Elisa Scaraggi, Marie Curie Fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History at New School of Social Sciences and Humanities in Lisbon. She's exploring themes of colonialism, coloniality in the Portuguese Empire, and reaching out her research interest in Angola and Brazil. And Meera Venkatachalam, she's a PhD. She has a PhD from SOAS, where we met, and as we were studying at the same period. She's social anthropologist and historian. She's exploring issues of circulation of ideas, capital, and people in Africa, between Africa and South Asia. She has co-authored the book Common Threads, Fabric Made in India for Africa in 2020, and co-edited, she's the co-editor of India Development Diplomacy and Soft Power in Africa in 2021. So we will start with the presentation of Elisa, which is entitled The Making of an International Struggle, Mário Pinto Andrade, Eurasian Connection and Angolan Liberation. Elisa, the floor is yours.
Yes. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this cycle of seminars and to share part of my research with you. And just to give you a bit of background, I am not an anthropologist. I was trained in comparative literature, and now I define myself mostly as a historian. I work mostly with cultural history. But I think some of the concerns that in the research interest of this group, such as embodied experience, are the same that lead my research. So I hope there are points of contact between our interests. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about the liberation struggle in Angola, and I'll focus in particular on transnational cultural exchanges, on how cultural gatherings and publications helped promoting the liberation struggle. And I will focus mainly on the early phases of the struggle in the early 1960s, examine it through the embodied experience of one of the key protagonists of this struggle, the Angolan intellectual Mário Pinto de Andrade, intellectual and politician. Sorry, let me share my screen. Just a second. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Yeah, okay. Not this one. I'm sorry, because I already started the presentation. That's my fault. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see it
Yes.
in the full page now?
Yes,
Okay.
now, yeah.
So, oh. Oh, no, okay, I'm too early. Okay. So yes, I was saying I will approach it through the perspective of Mário Pinto de Andrade, Angolan intellectual and politician. He was one of the founders and the first president of the liberation movement MPLA, that's the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, which eventually will emerge victorious and proclaim independence in 1975. And here, before we start, just a brief clarification. When I refer to Angolan Liberation Movement, I will speak about the MPLA, but the reality of the Angolan liberation struggle is much more complicated. There were several liberation movements active, and this was also one of the causes of the civil war that followed independence. So if you want, we can talk about the other liberation movements later in the discussion, but in my presentation, I will focus just on the MPLA. And as Eleni was saying, I am a postdoctoral fellow. My postdoctoral project is about the personal archive of Mário Pinto de Andrade. So most of the slides, most of the picture I'm bringing to you today are from his personal archive. And I also want to say this is much of a work in progress, so I kindly ask for your patience and understanding. And also, before I start, before I delve into my presentation, I wanted to give you some historical context about Portuguese colonialism, because I know that for non-specialists, it is sometimes kind of an obscure topic and far less widely known than British or French colonialism. And sometimes when I discuss with my project with people outside of academia, they don't even know that Portugal had colonies in Africa and that these colonies were among the last to gain independence in 1975, as I said. So last year, we celebrated the first 50 years of independence in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. And another point that is not so well known is that Portugal had one of the longest lasting fascist dictatorship in Europe, the Estado Novo, the new state, which was led by António de Oliveira Salazar. So sometimes it is referred as Salazarism as a regime. And it lasted from 1933 to 1974. So under the Estado Novo, the colonies were considered an integral part of the Portuguese nation. This idea was enshrined in the constitution, which defined Portugal as a pluricontinental nation, that is an indivisible state with whose sovereignty extended to the overseas territories. But this was more than a legal definition, because it was an idea deeply embodied, let's say, deeply shaped the Portuguese imagination, to the point that the Portuguese people could not imagine Portugal without the colonies. So this is a map from 1934, the year after the establishment of the Estado Novo, and the title translates to Portugal is not a small country. And we can see on the background of Europe as a comparison in terms of size, all the African and Asian colonies that Portugal had. Like we see here the size of each colony. And this was to say, Portugal, if it was all together, it would be a big country. So it's not to be considered as a small country. And looking at this map, it could be argued that Portugal suffered from a kind of inferiority complex in relation to other European powers, feeling the need to prove that it was not small and projecting itself as a vast empire or a great pluricontinental nation. But it should also be noted that Portugal was a very poor country and that it depended economically on the colonies. It could not afford to lose them because its revenues derived mostly from colonial export. So there are clear economic reasons for holding on to the colonies. And at the same time, there is also the fact that losing the colony would have meant for Portugal a radical transformation of its self-image. So this explains why when other European powers began began the process of decolonization after World War II, and they slowly started to grant autonomy or independence to their territories in Africa and Asia, Portugal took a different path, refusing to consider this option. Instead, it insisted that it did not have colonies, but rather overseas provinces, and it embraced an ideology based on the work of a Brazilian sociologist called Gilberto Freire, and the ideology is known as Luso-tropicalism. And the idea was to present Portugal and Portuguese colonialism as an exception in Europe, as a kind of colonialism that was exempt from racism, exempt from discrimination, exempt from violence, because it was based on the ability of the Portuguese to integrate harmoniously with the people they colonized. So the idea was that Portuguese people themselves are a mixed people. They are a result of different miscegenation, and so they could harmoniously integrate with other people. And this piece of propaganda, let's say, symbolizes this union of different races into the ideal of a great Portuguese nation. However, as you can imagine, the reality was very different from this proposed ideology. In fact, from 1926 onward, the legal framework in the colonies essentially created a two-tier system of citizenship based on race. The society was divided into natives and civilized, and only the civilized had access to citizenship rights. And the civilized, of course, were the white people. Natives, who were Black and mixed race, could aspire to social mobility through assimilation, that is, by proving to have reached the status of civilized, by fulfilling a series of conditions, such as, for example, proving that they spoke fluent Portuguese, they could eat with fork and knives, they lived in a proper house, they had a proper job, what the state considered a proper job. They were able to read and write, they were Catholic, they were monogamous, etc. So they had abandoned all African customs to adopt European ones. And by contrast, all white people were automatically considered civilized, regardless of their level of education, regardless of the fact they had a stable employment. So this was really a categorization based on race. And this two-tier system of citizenship was also, and perhaps above all, a device for controlling labor, since all non-assimilated natives were subjected to what was called the contrato, that's the contract, which is a euphemism for forced labor. So all men were forced to work for the state or for private contractors linked to the state for at least 6 months per year. Then the time varied from colony to colony, but this was like the general assumption. And here I have some pictures from the archive of Mário Pinto de Andrade of contracted workers in a coffee plantation in Angola. And coffee was one of the most exported commodity of Angola. And these sentences here are the inscriptions that are on the back of each picture. I translated them. So you can see they describe very hard working conditions. And you can imagine that having access to a workforce at basically no cost or at very low cost was a great incentive for the state not to conduct a real assimilation and to maintain this status quo. Moreover, while in the colonies, and especially in Angola, there had long existed a small elite of Black and mixed race assimilated people who traditionally worked in the colonial administration and enjoyed some privileges. From the 1930s onwards, this group became increasingly marginalized since emigration from Portugal to the colonies grew. So the number of white settlers increased, and this Black native elite progressively lost their privileges and their place in society. They became this native bourgeoisie became increasingly marginalized. So it is on this basis that a strong anti-colonial sentiment began to emerge, and the first political movements started to take shape. And here I want to pivot to my case study and to Mário Pinto de Andrade, who was born in 1928, and he was part of this local native bourgeoisie. This is why, unlike many other non-white people, he had the opportunity to receive a good education. When he was young, together with his brother Joachim, that later also became involved in the nationalist movement, they studied in the seminary of Luanda. So they learned Latin. They had a very classical, let's say, European education. And also the two brothers were among the few Angolans who could leave the colony after their studies to continue studying for university, to attend university abroad. And while Joachim he became a priest and went to Rome to study at the Vatican, Mário Pinto de Andrade went to Lisbon to study classical philology. And the idea was then to return to Angola and become a professor. However, once he found himself in Lisbon, in the heart of the empire, together with a group of students who came from other colonies, from Angola, but also from Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, Mozambique, he began to develop a critical awareness of the condition of assimilated colonial subjects. So together, this group of students came to realize that the education they had received was designed to turn them into Portuguese citizens and leaving them with little knowledge of Africa and of their own culture and identity and history. So once this awareness emerges, they collectively began a process that they called the re-Africanization of the spirits. And this growing awareness, as I said, took shape collectively and through a series of social practices. For example, they were regular attendees at this institution that was called the House of the Students of the Empire, Casa dos Estudantes do Império, which was an institution created by the Estado Novo, initially to train the future colonial elite, but actually it became a hub for anti-colonial sentiments. So it was a kind of a contradiction in terms. This institution, and they held this at the Casa. They held the poetry nights, for example, for students, and dance nights. And then there was also a cheap canteen where students gathered to eat and chat, and many subversive discussions started there. Nonetheless, this was a place under the control of the political police, which was ubiquitous in then Lisbon and also in the colonies. So Andrade was among the ones who felt the need to create a freer intellectual environment. And it was in this context that he was one of the founders of the Centro de Estudos Africano, the African Studies Center, which was a clandestine study group dedicated to discussing a wide range of topics related to Africa, including literature, history, linguistics, geography, politics, etc. And in several interviews, Andrade emphasizes that this period was crucial to his formation because it was a time when he and his peers shared the same books, they read the same books and discussed them. And often these were texts that were banned by the regime and circulated secretly, including key works on Marxism, but also the works of poets of the Negritude movement, for example, or the Harlem Renaissance. And indeed, poetry was an essential part of their intellectual formation and their expression. And also, they believed that through poetry, they could gain a voice in the public sphere. So in 1953, together with another poet, Francisco José Tenreiro from São Tomé e Príncipe, which is an archipelago in Africa, which was also a Portuguese colony, Andrade published the Caderno de Poesia Negra de Expressão Portuguesa. That's the notebook of Black poetry of Portuguese expression. These are the drafts of the publication that I found in his archive. And this is the actual publication. This is a very small booklet of just a few pages, self-published. So it's kind of a very simple publication, but still a historic one because this is the first anthology of poetry of Portuguese-speaking African writers. And just a few months after the publication of this anthology, Andrade was forced to self-exile in France. So he left Portugal because he was followed by the police. So to avoid the growing risk of an arrest, he had already been stopped and interrogated multiple times. He decided to self-exile to France, and he went to Paris. Sorry. Yes, and he became the chief editor for the well-known review Présence Africaine, which was a key platform for promoting public debate on African culture and the valorization of African culture, as well as supporting the affirmation of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist ideals. He was also the personal secretary of the director of Présence Africaine, who was the intellectual from Senegal, Alioune Diop. And also Andrade published his own articles on Présence, for example, this one about Lusotropicalism, the ideology that I explained briefly earlier. Other articles published in Présence and other reviews in France and Belgium. So he became quite known in the European anti-colonial environment and began to publish on political issues, but also, as we see, always also on poetry. And his work at Présence Africaine was important also because it gave him the opportunity to meet intellectuals from across Africa, Europe, and the Americas that in those years, we are talking of the 50s and early 60s, they converged in Paris a lot. So, for example, I will name just a few people, but the list is very long. Aimé Césaire, Léopold Senghor, Frantz Fanon, and Cheikh Anta Diop, and many others that I don't have the time to list. Actually, as Mário Pinto de Andrade himself said, there isn't a single intellectual from the Black world that I haven't met. All those who wrote, who left their mark, I met them. And this is a picture from the first Congress of Black writers and artists that took place in Paris in 1956. And this was organized by an association linked to Présence Africaine. So Andrade not only participated, but he was also among the organizers of these events, or this event. One of the greatest gatherings of Black intellectuals in the 20th century. So I believe it was here that he also realized that how important these gatherings were for meeting other people, for networking with intellectuals, politicians, publishers. And from his archives, we know that it is from roughly from this time on that he began to travel extensively across Europe. For example, he went to Belgium, Germany, Italy, but also he traveled across the Iron Curtain. And in 57, for example, he participated in the World Youth Festival in Moscow, one of the series of a series of events organized by leftist students associations, such as the World Federation of Democratic Youth. And I found a CIA report about this festival that describes it as a mammoth gathering that will serve as a major vehicle for current communist propaganda. And the same CIA report goes on to say that particular regional slogans such as nationalism and racial equality in Asia and Africa are utilized in wooing youthful sympathies. And though, I don't usually agree with the CIA, but this was actually true. And this was also this interpretation of what the World Youth Festival is echoed also by participants in the festival. For example, the poet and anti-colonial activist from Mozambique, Marcelino dos Santos, who was a close friend of Mário de Andrade, in an interview, he recalled that these events were highly political because the struggles for liberty were a principal preoccupation. We had the possibility to live together, young people from all over the world. And this allowed us to heighten the knowledge of what were our countries and the youth of these countries. In this way, being meetings of high importance. So Dos Santos emphasizes that these meetings were important not only because they provided a space where the cause of liberation was taken seriously, but also for a more informal dimension. So these young people were allowed to discover other cultures, and just as importantly, to share and have their culture recognized by others. So during this festival in Moscow, Andrade met several Africanist scholars, including Ivan Potiechin, director of the Institute of African Studies and president of the Soviet African Friendship Society. So he later wrote about this encounter in Présence Africaine in this article. And in this article, he describes his visit. He says he visited an exhibition on Africa in Soviet literature. He attended a session where the state of Soviet research on Africa was presented. And it also recalls many discussions on how historical materialism could be applied to the study of African societies. For example, how the process of nation formation could be analyzed through historical materialism. So he was deeply impressed by his trip to the Soviet Union. He was in Moscow, but he also stopped to Prague, on his route to Moscow. And he was very impressed by the communist system that he encountered. After returning in Paris from the festival, he wrote in a letter to an Angolan friend, and I quote from my translation, "You cannot imagine how extremely tired I am after these trips, especially because of the emotional shock, this abrupt transition from one regime to another, from amiability to competition, etc., etc." So we can see in this reaction also how he romanticized his experience in this communist country. The second second major gathering that he attended was the following year, 1958, in Tashkent, the then Soviet Republic of Uzbekistan. And this was the first Afro-Asian Writers' Conference. I have many pictures from this conference. Bear with me. I find them very interesting, and so I wanted to show them all. So here we see Mario Pinto de Andrade with many other delegates at the conference. This is the Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet, Chinese poet Ba King. So he's identified in the archive. Here, Mario Pinto de Andrade here in the background with other delegates. Yeah, sorry. So Natalia Telepneva, who is the author of this book called Cold War Liberation. Sorry, another picture. This is Andrade chairing a session, a plenary session in the conference. He delivered a speech on the advancement of African literature and how literature could advance only as nationalism advanced. Sorry, I was saying Natalia Telepneva, she's the author of this wonderful book called War Liberation. And she writes that Andrade made a very positive impression on the Soviet conference organizers. In an internal report, the Soviet Writers' Unions named him among a dozen other writers whose action coincided with the union's agenda. The effort of these people helped defend our Soviet line at the conference and achieve the correct decisions. So at this point, he was perceived as very much in line with Soviet's agenda. So at this conference, he met many people. You saw earlier the picture with Nazim Hikmet. Here you see the American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, so one of the founding fathers of the Pan-Africanist movement. Here, this is Marcelino dos Santos, whose words I read earlier. This is Andrade with Du Bois. And here, an iconic picture of many delegates posing with Nikita Khrushchev. So here we see Mario Pinto de Andrade. On the first line here, Marcelino dos Santos, and this is an Angolan poet, Viriato da Cruz, who was also one of the other founders of the MPLA. So among the founders of the MPLA and other Portuguese liberation movements in the African Portuguese colonies, we had many poets. At this conference, Mario Pinto de Andrade also met this woman. She is a Russian translator, Lydia Nekrasova, and she would play a crucial role in translating poetry and other literature from Portuguese language African countries in the Soviet Union. And with this translation, she also shared information about the struggles of colonial people. So after the conference in Tashkent, African delegates, including Andrade, were invited on an official trip to Moscow. And then, so they went to Moscow and then they continued to China. And this was a highly significant journey for the African delegates, at least for Andrade. It took place at a moment of intense political and social ferment in China. I will just read Andrade's words in an interview. He said, "This trip to China was a great revelation. It was the first time I had come into contact with such an immense reality, political and cultural, especially since at that moment the country was going through a period that later became controversial, the Great Leap Forward. Steel was being produced everywhere. The watchword was the unity of manual and intellectual labor, a commitment shared by everyone, with intellectuals directly involved in the production, which led to the huge rise in statistics that later proved to be false. But that is beside the point. There was an elan, an energy that we witnessed firsthand." So here again, we see a kind of romanticized vision of what these communist countries were. So he is aware that there were false statistics, but still this doesn't matter because they witness energy and elan. And also they witnessed something that for them was very important, which was an absence of racism, or at least they experienced an absence of racism in contrast, like in sharp contrast with their experience in Western countries. And this perception reinforced their conviction that socialism was the right political path. And here, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that there was no racism, just that they did not experience or they did not report it. In fact, other voices complicate this picture. For example, Mário Pinto de Andrade's partner, Sara Maldoror, who was a Black French filmmaker. She went to study cinema in Moscow, and she reported that she had never experienced as much racism as in Moscow. Everyone was trying to touch her hair or this kind of stuff. So I'm not saying that there was no racism, but maybe they stayed there for just a short time. And in contrast with their experience in Western countries, they saw a sharp difference, so at least in what was proclaimed. So this was an important point for them. And above all, the connections forged during these trips through the cultural gatherings, through the cultural experience they had in China, for example, or in Moscow, these all had significant repercussions once the actual armed struggle began, because from the, until this point, I have described the time where these people were involved in political work in a broad sense, but they were not yet organized in political movements. And also, I wanted to give you a visual representation of the Portuguese colonies in Africa, and also when the armed liberation struggle began. So Angola was the first country in 1961. Then Guinea-Bissau followed in 1963, and last Mozambique in 1964. And as I was saying, until 1960, we don't have news of the MPLA, for example. There had been a previous tentative to form a transnational political movement that put together people and militants from all the Portuguese colonies. This was called the MAC, Movimento Anticolonialista, Anti-Colonialist Movement, and it was formed in Paris in 1957. But it was important to foster debate, but it did not have really an impact, like a concrete impact. And it was just in 1960 that we moved to nationalist movements that begin to have a place, for example, at the All African People's Conference, and they begin to have a place at the UN. They are hosted also in London, for example, at the House of Commons in 1960. So we have to wait the turn of the decade for like a more effective political action, like direct political action. So when the MPLA is formed, Andrade is chosen as the first president. This was a prestigious position that required someone with strong personal prestige. And he had the social capital that he had accumulated in all these years at Présence Africaine and in the intellectual circles in Paris and also across Europe, as we saw. But as an emerging movement in desperate need of international recognition and support, because they needed everything for the beginning of the armed struggle, when it came to the foreign policy of the MPLA, they were oriented towards positive neutralism. So they that means that they accepted assistance from any country or international organization, provided that this aid was unconditional. This means that in the context of the Cold War, the MPLA refused to identify with either of the two blocs. And although it was perceived by many as a communist organization, it rejected this label. So despite what we saw, the fascination with the communist China and communist USSR, despite all this intellectual closeness to intellectual circles that were communist oriented, Andrade will never identify as a communist. And here I wanted to show, I hope this works, a brief extract from an interview with a British channel. This is from 1963. Tell me if you can hear.
You know, the Portuguese say you're a communist. You spend a lot of time in the Soviet Union, and you get a lot of help from the Eastern Bloc. Is this true?
Yes, this is an accusation of the Portuguese government. They say all these questions about ourselves and about UPA and all the nationalist movements. We are not communists. I am not a communist. I am a nationalist. And our movement is ready to accept help from all the countries. And
does that also mean help from Algeria? I believe the Algerians are helping you to train your soldiers.
yes, Algeria is one of the allies or one of the African allies in our struggle. And we have prepared, and we are preparing many of our soldiers in the Algeria itself, and the Algerian government is ready to continue to support our struggle, and we accept with pleasure.
Okay. Okay, so the main point, he says, I'm not a communist, I am a nationalist, and we are ready to accept help from every country. So later, if you want, we can discuss if and when these movements were or not communist or Marxist-oriented. But for now, I will say that this positioning themselves as nationalists and non-communist was meant to avoid alienating anti-communist public opinion, especially in Western countries, where the MPLA and other liberation movements had a great audience and where solidarity committees were formed. So in Western countries, which were allied, most of them allied of Portugal in NATO, the help for Portuguese for the liberation movement and against Portuguese colonialism arrived from civil society. While in the Eastern Bloc, the help arrived also through statal institutions. For example, here we see two letters that Mário Pinto de Andrade wrote to the governments of Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia. And here he is very explicitly asking for material support, mainly in the form of medicines, but especially weapons. Actually, he says, he asks that weapons should be concealed in crates of medicines, so the weapons could not be found and confiscated. So on the one hand, we see this very explicit request of support, very material support. And as you heard also in the video, he said about Algeria helping with training, military training. So there was all this material support. On the other hand, there were poetry and literary publication that still remained strategy to draw the attention of international public to the liberation struggle. Here I have some example of anthologies that Mário Pinto de Andrade published in Paris, in Rome, and in Algiers, all through the 1960s. But to conclude, I wanted to go back to the Soviet Union. And I'm going back to the book I showed earlier called War Liberation. And the author, she affirms that cultural exchanges with the new African allies became an important part of the engagement between the Soviet Union and Africa. And she talks, for example, of a poetry reading in Moscow that was attended by Marcelino dos Santos, the Mozambican poet we saw earlier, by Mário Pinto de Andrade, and Agostinho Neto, who was also a poet, and who was the politician who replaced Mário Pinto de Andrade as president of the MPLA. So it is interesting to read how a witness recalls this event. It says, a small hall in an old building of the library, Raisin Street, was filled to capacity. There gathered the library staff, readers, and simply young people who had found out there would be a meeting with the Africans gathered there. The guests did not expect such a lively interest in their art, and they read poetry in Portuguese and French. A famous translator, Lydia Nekrasova, read the poetry in Russian. The evening lasted into the night. Nobody wanted to leave. So we can see here there was an interest for this kind of events. And we see here, again, Nekrasova mentioned, and she collaborated on many other projects with Andrade. For example, the translation of this novel, Terra Morta, Dead Land, by the Angolan writer Castro Soromenho. And in 1965, we have a letter from Nekrasova to Andrade in his archives. She writes to him to ask him to review her selection of poems for a new anthology that was eventually published in 1967 and was titled Here Even the Grass Grows Red, a reference to a poem by Angolan poet Costa Andrade. Before I go on, I want to say that I don't speak Russian, so I wanted to thank the help of my friends Anya Moronchnik and Alessandra Trevisan for their help with the translations. And this anthology included a preface by Nekrasova, in which she wrote, and I quote from my friend's translation, "Our duty, the duty of Soviet people, of Soviet cultural workers, of Russian poets and translators, as true friends of nation fighting for independence, is to help our fellow writers and carry their passionate words to the widest possible circle of readers." So here I'd like to end with a reflection on poetry and this emotional force that we see that poetry had among foreign audiences. We read what happened at that reading in Moscow, for example. So there was this emotional force, but it was not different from what many militants inside the movement felt. After all, if there was so much poetry to be published, there were many people writing it. And many, as we said, many MPLA leaders were poets or had published poems. Mário Pinto de Andrade himself had some poems published. And as the war advanced, it became also increasingly common for guerrilla fighters with little literacy to write their own poetry inspired by the circumstances they lived in the bush or on the battlefield. And Andrade will publish also after the end of the Liberation War, and he will describe this kind of poetry as poesia di circunstancia, that is poetry of circumstance, which was whose value did not lie actually in the form, in the refinement, literary refinement, but in the circumstances in which it emerged. And last year, I was at a conference where there was this former militant of the liberation movement in Mozambique. He's called Oscar Monteiro, and he said that poems and poetry have always nourished the struggle. I believe it was part of the dose of romanticism that is necessary for any revolutionary. And I think that is something that runs through all of us who were involved in this action. Poetry brought all of us together. So poetry was a crucial element in the politicization of activists when we saw they read the Harlem Renaissance and the Negritude movement. So it helped shape their anti-colonial consciousness. Then it became, during the war, a vehicle of expression. And through my presentation, I've also tried to show how disseminating poetry also contributed to informing the international public opinion about the struggle and to foster networks of solidarity with the liberation movements. And I'm done. Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
very
attention.
much. Thank you very much, Elisa. And
Okay.
now we're moving to Meera. Her presentation is entitled India, Africa, and the Politics of Certain Solidarity, How the Third World Became the Global South. Meera, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just trying to share my screen.
It's coming.
Have you got it?
We can see your screen
All
and
right.
not the file.
Oh, right. Okay,
Yes.
just a moment.
Now we can see the file. No, back again to the
Okay.
file.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar series. This is very much work in progress as well, so I hope you'll be a bit patient with me. Please stop me at any moment if you want me to repeat, or if we suddenly lose connection and you can't hear me. So I'm trained as a historian and anthropologist, though I've started working on more. I started working more in the sphere of international relations and political science recently, so my work is really quite interdisciplinary. One of my interests, of course, being trained as an Africanist working in South Asia, is looking at the connectivities between South Asia and Africa, and that's how I really became interested in the politics of the Global South. So I'm really interested in what potential the Global South as a concept or a framework has to change or to challenge the current world order as we understand it. And of course, that's a very broad, open-ended question, and there are many ways of answering this question, depending on what you look at. You could look at cultural linkages, you could look at economic ones, you could look at struggles, you could look at internal and external power struggles, trans-regional ones, transnational ones, even ways in which the world is understood. The list is actually endless. But here I'm really looking at, I'm really inspired by what Burbank and Cooper have to say in this particular book. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but here what we talk about is what will the world look like soon? What can the world look like when against the backdrop of empire diminishing?
Meera, you should go back to your file. We're still seeing your screen. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to look at here is what happens when what might the world look like as we appear to be seeing the US empire diminishing in terms of its economic and political might, and also in terms of its normative ability to control what the world order looks like. And here we've got a lot of traditional political groupings at the moment in the form of NATO, in the form of the African Union, in the form of a number of regional and transregional associations. But really, is there a possibility for alternative groupings to be considered as serious spheres from where the world can be reimagined and from where a more equal world order can be orchestrated? And this is exactly what Burbank and Cooper talk about in this particular book. They're talking about a list of post-imperial possibilities that might be possible in this moment in time. Of course, it's all visionary at the moment, but there are a number of frameworks which may actually work. What I'm most interested in, of course, is the linkages between Africa and Asia. And I wonder whether applying the formula which Burbank and Cooper talk about in terms of post-imperial possibilities could be leveraged to talk about an Afro-Asiatic bloc, an Afro-Asiatic landscape, an Afro-Asiatic culturescape, if you like, which could have the potential of redefining the world? Again, this is a very, very broad, open-ended question. I think it's relevant in the field of humanities and social sciences, especially at this point in time, because in the last 10 years, we've seen a kind of mushrooming of Indian Ocean studies, which basically talks about the Indian Ocean as an intense cultural sphere of exchange between India and Africa. There's no shortage of journals dedicated to the political, economic, and social linkages between, societies on the spheres of the Indian Ocean. And these linkages have been analyzed in great detail, including the solidarities that grew out of conversations between colonized people and their ability as well as their desire to change the world order. And what we've also seen, I would say, in the last 5 years is we've seen this kind of framework extended to both the Indian and the Atlantic Ocean. So we've had a lot of conversations about how West African societies in particular interacted with societies of the Indian Ocean. And what we find is that even though they're geographically disconnected, they're not very different because they share certain experiences of colonization, of marginalization, of sort of acute perceived irrelevance in the global world order. So what I'm trying to do here is really to look at the history of Afro-Asia as a construct and also investigate its strengths and its weaknesses, why some of these exchanges to construct solidarities failed, and how they could possibly be leveraged in future to achieve something else, something that's more productive, something that might be capable of actually changing our understanding of the world, and also our understanding of struggle, our understanding of how of realizing a more equal world order. Right, so I start my story here. Everybody's familiar with what the world looked like about 20, 25 years ago. You had the free world, we had the communist bloc, and then we had something that was called the third world. And of course, in my understandings of the third world, I understand the third world to be a political project. And on this, I draw on the work of a number of Indian Marxist historians when I talk about this political project, in particular people like Vijay Prashad, who basically analyze the third world really not as a geographical sphere, but as a sphere of intense conversation between people who had similar desires in terms of realizing an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist world order. So the third world is really an unfinished political project for many people who understand it to be this area of intense contestation. And the thing is, the third world doesn't actually cease to exist when the communist bloc falls. But the third world was capable of actually producing certain political and economic movements. And we still live with their repercussions today, however faint they may be. Generally, what united third world nations was that they were in the 1950s, they were soon to be independent or newly independent countries. Again, they were greatly aware of their political and economic marginality. They were incredibly uneasy with the emerging liberal capitalist world order, and they were actually looking for a radical economic alternative. What we, of course, see is that there's a complete unease with the bipolar world order, which was to be dominated by the US and the Soviet Union. And here, the best expression of this was perhaps the Bandung Conference, which was held in Indonesia in 1955. You had a number of countries and soon-to-be emergent countries come to Bandung. I mean, of course, Bandung is kind of achieved a kind of mythologized status, but if we actually look at what was discussed there, it was very much how to try and create a more equal world. And there were a number of agreements that were actually drafted, if not acted upon or ratified. But if you analyze the output of that, it's a complete conceptual reordering of what the economics and what the economic and social framework of the world ought to look like. And of course, it's significant that it comes from the third world. It's significant that it comes from people who've suffered a sort of humiliating history of colonization and marginalization. What we see is we've got a number of stories of how Southern solidarity emerged in a decolonizing world. I think most of you might be familiar with this. You had exchanges between countries like India, soon to be emerging countries in Africa. The key architects, of course, were people like Jawaharlal Nehru from India, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, and Nasser from Egypt. What was interesting about the third world is that you had a third way. Essentially, you had the non-aligned movement, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's a political movement which pledged not to align with the policies of the United States, neither the Soviet Union. However, many of the third world countries were very socialist in their outlook, in the sense that many of the economic reforms and the economic plans drafted at independence were very much inspired by the Soviet Union and their economic planning, and put into practice in a very sort of systematic way. What we find interesting about the third world is that you also had an acute sense of solidarity that was put into practice. So here you have Nehru talking to Kwame Nkrumah, and this is him talking at the Asian Relations Conference of 1947. And here, essentially, what he's saying is that Indians have a responsibility towards people of Africa to help them take a rightful place amongst the nations of humanity. And what he's essentially doing is he's setting up India in a kind of paternalistic role to suggest that it will essentially guide African nations to achieve the status of nationhood, of freedom. But what's essentially interesting about this particular conversation is the idea that you have a sense of solidarity, a sense that there are connections and shared experiences in the third world, and that nations are responsible to help each other out. And that's a thought that you should hold on to, because I'm going to come back to it. So India's policy was very moralistic and guided by what it believed was right and wrong soon after independence, and it was committed, for instance, to decolonization of Africa. So India played a very critical part. India played a significant part in the dismantling of apartheid. So India recognized the ANC when nobody else did. India also supported liberation struggles in South and Southeastern Africa through logistics, through finances, through all kinds of activities which were frowned upon, but not really known until after the struggles had concluded. So anti-imperialism and achieving independence for countries of the global South was a very, very pivotal part of India's strategy towards the other countries of the third world. There were other powers in the third world that actually, coming back to India, India also heavily invested in training nationals of other third world countries, especially Africa. And India dispersed a number of scholarships and a number of training schemes, which were specially reserved for Africans. The payment, this was actually paid for by the Indian taxpayer. The money came out of the Indian national budget, and it was like a gift. There were absolutely no commercial transactions attached to this. And India's vision of South-South cooperation, of South-South relations, of South-South economic exchanges actually grow from this idea that you needed to achieve solidarity through a kind of altruistic set of actions, such as training, such as imparting knowledge, such as sharing expertise, things like that. What I wanted to also highlight is that there were a number of other countries that also thought of themselves as integral parts of the third world, like China, for instance. And China, like India, also had a very targeted strategy towards African nations. China also believed it was a kind of Asian leader, and that it could achieve a kind of Afro-Asian bloc, if you like, by essentially chaperoning African nations. I know the language is very paternalistic, but I'm again looking at some of the texts that I've read myself, and that's what it translates into. The idea is that you can help these nations who haven't quite understood nationhood and nation building to achieve that. And in doing so, of course, this is part of your own soft power strategy, but it's also part of realizing this idea of a southern world, of a southern-centric world, which could stand in domination to the global north, essentially. So China had a very strong Africa outreach, which included the sharing of health expertise, of medical expertise, training African personnel, and also They had a number of teachers, doctors, and professionals working on the continent in the 40s and 50s. The Chinese Communist Party has a number of fantastic posters just like this, which has sort of been circulated all over, which bears testimony to these exchanges. China did something else that no other southern country could achieve at that point, which was actually invest in Africa. Of course, this has taken on completely different dimensions now, and I'll come to that shortly. But this is the famous Freedom Railway line, which was built by China between 70 and 75. And again, the funding from this came exclusively from China. It didn't come from, it came from the Chinese government, and it was very much conceived as a gift, as a kind of investment in African development as such. So one of the crucial things about economic and human to people-to-people exchanges in the then Third World was a very strong idea that development was a sort of shared enterprise, and solidarity was something to be created for a more prosperous world. And of course, in doing so, they were trying to distance themselves from traditional powers in the global north, for whom aid and for whom these exchanges came about from more hierarchical relationships, which were defined by a status as a former colonizing power, the status as the imperial hegemon in the case of the United States. And of course, the northern aid was always conceived as a gift, as a kind of conditional transaction, whereas southern powers wanted to change the financial and the economic landscape of the world altogether by suggesting that these are non-hierarchical exchanges by which everybody sort of grows together. Right, I think the most significant contribution of the Third World, of course, was the new international economic order, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And I think just so basically the most significant contribution so far. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
The most significant
Say again
contribution.
your file. Yeah. Now we can see your file.
Okay, the most significant contribution, of course, of the Third World working together as a collection of nations was the new international economic order, which was essentially debated and floated on the 1st of May. So we're not very far away from that anniversary. The new international economic order essentially wanted to challenge the emerging Washington, what we would come to know as the Washington Consensus, and the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, which were incredibly restrictive and incredibly oppressive to nations of the Third World. The new international economic order essentially talked about absolute control over national resources by nations of the Third World. It talked about restricting the powers of predatory multinationals. It talked about it talked about regulating international banking institutions quite severely in the way that profits would not flow to the global north. It essentially talked about remaking the periphery of the world as it stood at that moment. A periphery, of course, which was organized against an American and European core. So I think this is significant in the sense that to summarize what the Third World actually stood for, it was a political project that sought to remake the nations of the Third World not into a periphery but into equal partners in the global order through a number of diplomatic and mainly economic channels. And I think many of these. It's important to note that at that point in time, a lot of these expressions of solidarity were state-driven. They were driven by state actors. They were driven by people. They were driven by emergent nations that actually had a vision for what not just their nations, but also their regions and what the world ought to look like. So you saw very, very strong state-to-state connections. You saw very, very strong national connections. You saw very, very strong involvements in nations beyond, in the affairs of other Third World nations, and a very strong ethic of solidarity. Right, and now I think if we look back maybe to exactly what these economic linkages were envisioned as, what we see is that this sort of South-South cooperation centered around the idea of Southern solidarity is very different from what Western and Northern donors suggested when they talk about development. So South-South cooperation was essentially envisioned as a project of solidarity. But also what was crucially interesting is that emergent nations didn't think of them as an act of charity, but more an act of opportunity. They were very, very strongly framed in terms of mutual benefit to both, let's say India or Africa, say Africa or China, from where from who was actually doing who was propelling the discourse of development and who was actually dispatching the funds. So this was framed as an exercise of mutual benefit, of sort of win-win outcomes, of very much an exercise in reciprocity. And South-South cooperation it was also framed in terms of empathy based on shared experiences. It was always believed to be demand-driven. So countries needing external assistance would request it through various international forums. And it was basically about co-producing knowledge, co-producing solutions for essentially how to achieve economic and political reform. And it was also based on non-interference with respect to sovereignty. And what's completely different is that North-South exchanges were conceived as acts of charity, were conceived from a completely different point of view. It was sort of a more hierarchical exchange. It was more about superior institutions, knowledge and science being transmitted to the poorer countries of the global South. So what I'm trying to say here is that Southern nations managed to position themselves in the development landscape through a completely different paradigm. And here again, I'm trying to assess whether this paradigm has eventually worked in terms of realizing a sort of Afro-Asian framework, which many people sought to do in the 1940s and 50s. What we see in the 1990s is a complete change in the global landscape. We see the fall of the USSR and we see the fall of the Second World as such. And for many countries like India, that poses a significant change in the sense that India lost its main ally, its main political ally, and its main and the power that supported it most in multilateral forums. So essentially, what we see here is a restructuring of the Third World. We see other very mega global events that also come hot on the heels of this in about 10 or 20 years. We see the war on terror beginning. We see various nationalisms in parts of Eurasia, and we see various other very, very significant events that would change the relationship between Africa and Asia. And also we see a completely different new financial architecture coming into being, a more aggressive financial architecture that emerges from the global imperial metropole. Now, the Third World, interestingly, changes in name and mutates into something that we now call the Global South. And what I suggest through my work is that the Global South is really the neoliberal descendant of the Third World, in that the Global South is formed on the back of a major financial and economic restructuring of the world in terms of how the geographies of production are envisioned. And this means the Global South is not a political project in the way that the Third World was. It's become more a sort of neoliberal hang-on to the world order that kind of plays along with the emerging world order and the emerging systems of exchange. And I'll go into this with talking about Afro-Asia a little more. So in the last 20 years, we've seen a great, we've seen a great deal of exchanges between nations of the Global South. And in theory, this should be a good thing. So, for example, Indian investments and Indian activities in Africa have risen exponentially. Indonesia, there are a great deal of exchanges between Indonesia and Africa, similarly with Turkey and Africa. These countries invest in a number of sectors, right from agriculture to health to information technology and now AI. They have joint military exchanges. There's all kinds of things happening, which would suggest that these exchanges are actually forming an alternative to North-South movements. And this would genuinely give rise to a sort of a more sort of compact, more integrated Afro-Asian sphere. And what I'm trying to understand is whether this is really the case, whether these linkages and whether these emerging exchanges are a good thing, or whether whether something else is happening that we need to be aware of. So most countries, I'm talking particularly from India's experience, but most countries seem to have followed somewhat similar trajectories, except of course China. So India moves in the 1990s from essentially after the fall of the Second World and after many financial institutions of global governance from in the northern metropole are empowered, India moves from a protectionist to a free market economy. This of course involves dismantling some of the bureaucratic red tape. You've got lower corporate taxes, you've got greater incentives for FDI, the same formula that you see everywhere else. India, of course, relies heavily on a domestic pool of consumers, and its success and its economic growth can be understood as an empowerment of the consumer class domestically at home. But India is able to, after these reforms, essentially reach out to other geographies of the global south and essentially export credit, export expertise, empower its multinationals to empower its private sector to access these new geographies. So I think that's that's an interesting development that sees increased Indian investments and increased Indian cultural, economic, and social activity in Africa. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Right. And what we see after the 1990s all across Afro-Asia is an empowered private sector which seeks to internationalize beyond its geographies of operation. India, Turkey, and like a number of other number of emerging metropoles in the third world, in the former third world, essentially are able to float lines of credit which are through a combination of private and public sector finances. And the curious thing is these lines of credit are then lent to other countries to perform development, to invest in infrastructure, invest in health, invest in a number of other sectors. But India redefines the idea of Southern solidarity. It's the whole idea of Southern solidarity is reimagined in neoliberal terms. It's reimagined as a neoliberal exercise of where credit essentially plays an important part, and where the state-to-state dimensions of the exchange are sort of belittled. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is that cooperation between Southern countries is gradually becoming more private sector led. You have a number of disconnected actors in this space, like civil society, like small organizations, small firms, large multinationals, all kinds of development banks which operate through a multitude of geographies, and the state merely functions as a kind of guarantor for those for these various other entities. And essentially what we're seeing here is we're seeing the neoliberalization of the idea of what solidarity means. Solidarity now means an economic exchange. It doesn't really mean empowerment of citizens. It doesn't really mean people-to-people exchanges, and the state is no more the guarantor of that act. So that's what we see happening in from about 20 years ago, and it seems to be getting more and more pronounced now. Also, these things didn't actually come out of nowhere. You had steady changes initiated by Northern hegemonic powers all the way from the 80s. You see the World Bank and you see American actors in particular trying to, in their promotion of structural adjustment policies, they're actually trying to encourage sort of private sector deindustrialization throughout the global south. And there are wonderful documents to actually suggest that they see this as an act of political reordering. They see this as an act of breaking not just solidarities between countries, but essentially the social fabric within societies itself. So what happens here is that these South-South exchanges with these reorderings in the global south put in force by the global north become a sort of technical problem-solving exercise rather than a long-term visioning of what economic change needs to be and how economic change needs to be achieved. So essentially, you've got a twofold assault on Southern solidarity. You've got an assault from the north, and you've essentially got an assault from reforms in neoliberal states of the global south as well. Also, again, market-driven economies are doing essentially what they need to do to survive, which is export and find markets for their products. And a lot of India's so-called solidarity in the south is not really geared towards improving the lives of citizens across the board, but really exporting its own products. So what we see is that lines of credit have actually been directed towards agricultural products, to products that don't really, to products that are produced in surplus in the country here. And I think the similar cases, Turkey and Indonesia follow a similar trajectory, as does China to a large extent. So essentially, these are more about creating market linkages between the global south. South-South cooperation has become something completely different. More worryingly so is that with hyper-nationalist states, with highly militarized states in the global south, you're seeing a large scale, you're seeing defense linkages between emerging states like India and consumers in Africa who are not necessarily state actors, but non-state actors. So you're seeing, what the point I'm trying to make is you're seeing economic linkages realized through commodities that are not necessarily a public good at all, that don't contribute to development as we are meant to be envisioning it. It's just a market-driven exercise. I think another important point is that after the 1990s, we see a sort of cultural and social shift within the global south, within societies of the global south, within the emerging powers like India and Turkey, and maybe to an extent Indonesia. We see and China, of course, we see they conceive of themselves as civilizational states rather than nation states. We see that in India with the rise of the Hindu right. We see that with the rise of ethno-nationalism. Some people would even go so far as to call it ethno-fascism. So Indian actors think of themselves not as a bounded nation state, but as a civilizational entity that's been around for ages, that's had a massive influence in its spheres of influence. So as you can see here, you've got an ancient Indosphere, which is reimagined thousands of years prior to where we are now. You have Indian influence in South Africa, you have Indian influence in Africa, in Southeast Asia. So this sort of empowers Indian actors in a cultural sense to give them the legitimacy to operate as they like without very little accountability beyond state borders. And this is increasingly what we're seeing in the actions of some of the actors involved in what we call South-South cooperation today. A civilizational state is essentially different is essentially receding on the index of democracy in many ways. They're characterized by very strong centrifugal forces that try to produce a sort of national culture, that try to produce a sort of homogenization within the country itself. And civilizational states are essentially authoritarian, right? So a lot of these civilizational states operating beyond their boundaries might not see their actions in terms of as an act of Southern solidarity. They see it as a sort of civilizational entitlement to do so. And I think that is what characterizes India's current approach to Africa. So the sense of Southern solidarity, the sense of equality, the sense of shared colonial inheritance has gradually diminished. And you've got the idea of an exceptional India engaging the global south. It's the same with China. You also have an idea of an exceptional China, an exceptional Chinese civilization, cultural attributes that are quite unique. And China has been successful in getting to where it is today. You see an export of a sort of Chinese idea of doing things, a way of actually understanding what China is meant to be giving to the world. So you see this very, in terms of the BRI, for example, it's all about reviving a sense of civilizational China. And China uses this quite heavily in its Africa policy, in its rhetoric of Southern solidarity now. So I think the idea of civilizational states and the civilizational understanding of what states are meant to do has changed the equation of what Southern solidarity might look like, of what Afro-Asia could look like. What also goes hot on the heels of civilizational states is the idea that a lot of these emerging metropoles in the global south, emerging powers in the global south, like India and China, have something unique to actually give other parts of the global south that are less developed than them. So there's a very strong idea in India at the moment that you have an Indian model of development, which actually may work for other societies. An Indian model of development is, of course, characterized by the things listed here. It's pluralistic democratic polity, it's decentralized government, demand-driven economic landscape. It's got a unique blend of private and public sector actors, a non-expansive geopolitical outlook, and a people-centric development. And again, the idea that this could be exported to other parts of the global south comes not from India, but it comes from American actors and American think tanks. So Larry Summers in 2010 in Mumbai declares that there is this Mumbai consensus, which actually works very well for other parts of the global south. In reality, the Indian model of development works very well for the imperial hegemon to keep an eye on exactly what's going on and to control, because India is so deeply integrated into the global financial structure. It's a Mumbai consensus would actually be beneficial to players in the global north rather than India's relationship with Africa and realizing an independent Afro-Asian bloc. So here you've got an extension of the idea that India can provide solutions for Africa. It's been taken up by the highest lobbies. This is the foreign minister of India, who's actually talking about how an Indian model of development can be exported across geography. So the rhetoric in India very much is, as is the rhetoric in Turkey, as is the rhetoric in other states in the global south, is that they have uniquely evolved a development model which can be applied to less developed parts than themselves. And by less developed parts of the third world, they mean Africa. So everybody has a solution for Africa. And what I'm trying to understand here is how fractured the idea of Afro-Asia has become over the course of the last 50 years. When you've got uneven growth across the third world, you've got very little political blocks that could actually envision a more sort of inclusive way of developing cultural and economic linkages across the global south. Although the rhetoric of Southern solidarity and the memory of Bandung is evoked by these newly emerging states in the global south, like India, their actions have turned into something else. Their actions have turned into exporting a kind of Indian way of doing things, fueled by a sense of their own exceptionalism. Here's another example of this. This is an Indian business leader who's essentially saying that the Indian model can be applied to Africa as it's frugal and low cost. So this is just a continuation of that way of thinking. And now, theoretically, I wonder how anybody is to make sense of these developments. Of course, Africans who are also invested in the idea of Afro-Asia have quite a lot to say about this. They often accuse Asian powers of being new colonizers. And it is very true that very different relationships based on inequality are developing between Afro-Asia. There are different power relations at play, and you've got relationships that are definitely unequal and oppressive emerging out of these economic exchanges. However, using the word colonization, accusing them of being the new colonizers is not a sort of lazy terminology, because they don't come out of the same history of ideas, the same experience of ideas as the older colonizers did. So essentially, India and China have not colonized Africa at all. However, they're doing something else, which I will come back to in a moment. Now, the idea that the newly emerging states of Afro-Asia are detrimental to Africa has been taken up by African intellectuals, and we see a lot of resistance to the idea of Afro-Asia from Africa, from peoples and societies who were once invested in the idea. Here you have a very symbolic image. This is a picture of a Gandhi statue at the University of Ghana, which was gifted by the Indian government to Ghana in 2016, being pulled down. And I think this is an interesting image because it shows us some of the fissures, some of the rifts within this discourse of Afro-Asia. So Africans, Gandhi, of course, is the father of the Indian independence movement. He's an anti-imperial figure. He's known for bringing down the British Empire. He's the father of the Indian nation. Many leaders across the then Third World hailed him as a model of nonviolence, a model of peaceful struggle, and were, at least in theory, said they were inspired by what he did. However, in recent years, decolonial readings of what Gandhi actually did have shown that he was actually that he harbored some very racist views towards Africans. So African scholars again believe that he was not an appropriate figurehead to have at all, because they believed that the Indian freedom struggle was that they believed that Gandhi, the persona of Gandhi, was actually anti-African. So essentially what you're seeing here is you're seeing, of course, a rejection of Gandhi based on the fact that he was racist, and his early writings show that, but you're also seeing a rejection of a sort of Indian and Asian model of development. You're seeing a rejection of the idea that Africa could progress like India did, or through a way that's charted out by India or Asian powers. You're seeing a complete writing back of the idea of Afro-Asia. You're seeing a rejection of Asian solutions for Africa. You're seeing a rejection of that entire relationship. You're seeing a rejection of that solidarity, essentially. So here, this happened in 2016. There were widespread protests in the University of Ghana until the Gandhi statue was actually pulled down and taken away. And interestingly, the people that protested these Gandhi statues likened him to Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, because this came hot on the heels of the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And in a way, equating Rhodes with Gandhi is quite problematic, because Rhodes, of course, was a white supremacist. And the founding father, Rhodes was a white supremacist, whereas Gandhi was an anti-imperialist figure. But the point here is that Africans felt that they were both figures of oppression. West Africans felt that they were both figures that sort of aided imperial oppression. One, of course, was an imperialist, and they categorized the other as a sub-imperialist, somebody who worked at one point to actually further an imperial cause. Right. Again, going back to how Southern nations in particular have tried to subvert the world order, I'm not suggesting that these hyper-nationalist, ethno-nationalist states are not concerned about changing the world order. I think they are. And I think many of their actions are still driven by a very strong idea of Southern solidarity, a very strong idea that they need to amplify their own voices within various multilateral arenas. So, for example, you have the BRICS grouping that came into being in the late that was conceived in the late 1990s and came to being in 2000, after 2000s. BRICS, of course, is a completely random grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the BRICS nations essentially wanted to redo development on their own terms. And they floated something that many of you might be familiar with. It's called the New Development Bank. It's based in Shanghai. The ethos of the New Development Bank was to lend on terms that are more favorable to the global South, to lend on terms that are more favorable to borrowing countries, and not actually strap them under debt, as is the case in North-South exchanges, as is the case when the IMF lends. However, the BRICS actually stands accused of sub-imperialism by many academics, and most famously by the South African academic Patrick Bond, who analyzes their patterns of lending and suggests that they are very much in line with North-South lending, very much in line with the IMF, and therefore can't actually function as an independent financial system at all. Of course, the other problem with the BRICS is that they're not able to weaken the petrodollar. They haven't been able to weaken the petrodollar so far. There are huge contradictions within the BRICS. You have India and China sometimes at war with each other every now and then. You have a few disagreements between Russia and China. The BRICS, of course, was enlarged 2 years ago to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE, which makes it all the more interesting at this point in time. A recent BRICS summit about a few weeks ago in New Delhi concluded inconclusively, simply because the contradictions between the various players was just so intense. The contradictions were intense mainly on account of certain political events. So I'm sure you must be familiar with this, but India tried to water down a statement on Israel and Palestine, on Israel's actions in Gaza. And other powers protested quite strongly to this. And this was a bit of a scandal at home, but there we are. So I think the BRICS at least sees its role as trying to change the global financial architecture. And interestingly, it would seem as if the current events in the Persian Gulf and the attack on Iran has actually reignited that debate. And it would seem as if something is happening about it. But interestingly, it comes through Iran's actions as opposed to the collective bargaining of BRICS nations who've been around for the last 2-3 decades. Right, so my analysis of these emerging powers in the global south, of India, Turkey in particular, and to an extent China, is that they're not neo-colonial. There's very little African agency involved in how these relationships are crafted, but they're sub-imperial. And by sub-imperial, I mean a power that's able to align itself with the policies of the imperial hegemon and further them to its own interests. And I mean not just political policies, not just geopolitical policies, but also economic ones. And I think the problem with these financial and economic architectures that allow for exchanges in the globe, in Afro-Asia, is that they follow well-established colonial patterns of exchange. They haven't actually been able to carve new avenues for the externalization of credit, for the exchange of ideas, for anything, essentially. And so these exchanges are rightly characterized as sub-imperialism. They fit very well, and they also serve this is something that's encouraged by the global hegemon because it doesn't really shake the balance of power. It doesn't really shake the flow of resources. It's something that allows for status quo. And my last question that I'm a bit concerned with is exactly what Afro-Asia would look like in an emerging multipolar world, or a multiplex world. And by multiplex world, I'm drawing on this idea by Amitav Acharya, who's an Indian political scientist. And what he's suggesting is that a multiplex world is not just a multipolar world with 4 or 5 emerging powers with neatly crafted spheres of influence. Rather, it's a bit like a multiplex cinema, and you can turn on which screens you want to watch when, and you can look away from one screen, and then you have another screen to engage with. So in a multiplex world, you're talking about not just state actors, but a number of non-state actors who might be able to shape the nature of conversations and exchanges that happen. And I think this is probably where we sit at the moment, and what Afro-Asia or the global south will look like in a few years alone is really up for grabs, depending on how it's shaped. But I think that states, as we see them in Afro-Asia, with democracies in retreat, with electoral democracies especially, essentially just functioning in name, functioning as a performative act, with eroding civil society, with increased economic hardship, which leads to some kind of social unrest, which is then dealt with in very authoritarian terms, with emerging ethno-states, with greater militarization, with essentially, with all these factors. What we're going to see is state actors taking the backseat when it comes to these South-South exchanges. So here again, we see a complete difference in the way the landscape looked in the 60s, 50s and 60s, where states were at the forefront of driving these exchanges. Now we're seeing, now it's likely that these exchanges will be driven by civil society, by networks by knowledge networks, by all kinds of other non-state actors, essentially. Is there any potential to realizing this? Yes, I think so. But I think the actors involved in this space need to be extremely imaginative and also extremely astute in trying to navigate their actions in a way that is productive, given the restrictions of funding, given the political repression, given the difficulty that it is, that the difficulties in crossing international borders, the difficulties in getting ideas across, and really the difficulties in just mobilizing people. So yeah, I think Afro-Asia did have potential. It started off with with great ideas that might have been able to shake the world. It still has those potential. It still has that sort of potential in there somewhere. But really, how that's going to be realized is very different from what we've seen to date, what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 decades. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meera, for this very rich presentation and very innovative ideas regarding Afro-Asia. I will open the floor for discussion. I will take questions. Yes, Yanni.
Hello, everybody. Thank you both very much for these very, very intriguing presentations, which are, thanks to Eleni, they offer a different perspective of the one that we usually deal with, I mean, geographically. Now, I have one question, I mean, for both of you. I mean, different questions for each one for both of you. So, first of all, to Elisa, I was trying to imagine the material you have. If this is the traditional kind of archive with, a lot of compiled objects, information, it seems like it from the pictures that you mentioned. But anyway, based on this assumption, it's very interesting how it brings together all these different contexts, like colonial, Cold War, intellectual. And it seemed to me that it's not only the history of the Angolan liberation, but I mean, how it is projected and it becomes communicable, but how also solidarity is created really rather than given. So I'm just thinking and wondering if you'd like to say a few things. To what extent these international connections are already present in the archive, or to what extent they emerge through the way you bring the material together, okay? And you said, and it's always a very important aspect, that Andrade was a member of the elite, right? The intellectual and the political elite. So to what extent the archive, somehow reflect the perspective of the elite, and what happened? And if yes, what happens with the rest of the other perspectives? And then to Meera, well, very rich, very complex. It is a very productive process you're in. To the extent, I have grasped some of the things you talked about. I was wondering to what extent the Global South, functions not only as a political project or geographical category. You said a lot about this, but also as a framework for how knowledge is produced. In the sense that, it shapes who gets to produce theory, what becomes visible, and which perspectives are recognized as authoritative. So how do you see, if my question makes sense, and if I understand correctly what you said, how do you see the relationship between the Global South as a political project and as a site of knowledge production? Thank you.
Shall we take more questions, or would you like to respond to this one?
As you prefer.
Okay, I have two questions following Yannis, so I will put them now. That gives you space to think and respond to both of them. So I was very intrigued, Elisa, from this idea, your conclusion rather, when you came back to poetry as a way to not only to revolutionize language or form, but revolutionize political consciousness. So how much space you think there is now to use poetry in this kind of as this kind of tool for turning words into action in this kind of experimental and radical way. And the other one is again going to what Yannis was saying about how you present the archive. If there are other connections of Andrade with neighboring countries, socialist or socializing intellectuals within the African context, for example, the French-speaking socialist countries or socializing countries, like Senegal, for example. Because it was interesting, we had photographs from Tashkent, we have this powerful black guy being very at ease with all these other socialist intellectuals. But I kept wondering, how would he act and behave and communicate with his fellow intellectuals within the African context? And to Meera, going back to the production of knowledge, Yannis was saying, and the Global South. So my question is, because both of you and you, Meera, said how much South-to-South cooperation benefited from the mobilities of intellectuals, young people for training or for education to India. So I was wondering about the role of education and universities or other spaces of production, of formal production of knowledge that become more and more internationalized and part of this neoliberal matrix of production and reproduction, how much they can play a role in this politicizing this global south and not leaving it as a space of neoliberal exchange of capital. Emilia?
Yes, thank you both for your presentations. To me, it was really like very interesting because we don't get the chance to hear about this context, and I'd like to bring the two presentations into conversation together, since as I saw it, at least they both touch on different forms of transnational political imagination. And I was wondering how do nationalism, as Andrade claimed in his interview, the socialist internationalism of the USSR, they had connections, and global South, as in Meera's presentation, solidarity, global South solidarity, relate to one another. Do you see them as competing frameworks or flexible political repertoires? And is there room for claims for a civilizational identity as civilizational states within this landscape? And also, this goes for more for Meera. Could we think of BRICS as a contemporary articulation of this earlier project, or does it signal a move away from their more explicitly political and anti-colonial dimensions?
Okay, I think you.
Can I start? Okay, so thank you for all the questions. They're very spot on, I think. Like also my project is really about the personal archive of Mario Pinto de Andrade, and I've been dealing with how personal archives are like very weird creatures. Because it's not like an institutional archive. We have all kind of materials. Can I share my screen for a second? So let me try. Can you see? So
We can see.
the personal archive of Mario Pinto de Andrade is mostly been digitalized. There are many problems with the digital archive, but it's still very useful to use it. One of the problems is that it was started the digitalization in the early 2000s, so some documents are really illegible. So you really have to go to the physical archive. But you can see here we have just digitalized more than 4,000 documents, and they are all kinds of documents. So we have pictures, we have press, we have publications. For example, here are all the documents for the Congress in Havana, which was also something that Meera was talking about, the precursor of the Tricontinental. So there are, for example, also many pictures. Some of them I showed, but also pictures of the Andrade, for example, in the guerrilla in Angola, Tricontinental in Havana. This is just press, so personal correspondence, more than 600 letters. So this is just to say it's a very, there is a lot of material, and it's all, you can see, we have documents from Frelimo, the Mozambican liberation movement. We have documents from the liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau, from Angola, and other parts of the world. So, sorry, just stop sharing. Then if you want, if you're interested, I can share the website. Then we have family documents. So there is a variety of documents that is really amazing, also covering almost 4 decades of his life. And so it's been challenging for me. Like I first had to go through, quickly see what was there, and then see what was interesting to me. And first of all, select what I want to work with. And for example, I chose only documents related to the Angolan liberation struggle. So I didn't consider all the documents related to Guinea, Bissau, to Mozambique, to Cape Verde. Andrade, after he has a very interesting life. He was the founders and first president of this movement, but then he was a dissident inside this movement. So after independence, he was forced to exile from his own country. And he became Minister of Culture in Guinea-Bissau. So there is another phase of his life that is in another country. And just to say, then he worked for UNESCO in the 80s. And all these kind of documents, I've kind of, I've kind of watched them, but I am not working with them. So to say there is a great variety. And for me, for example, correspondence has been one of the most interesting, because also you see the personal side of this person beside all the public images and public persona. You can see also like the intimate part. Also, like they're full of notebooks just with citation with books. And he was also an academic. He had he didn't complete his studies, but he studied at Sciences Po in Paris. And then so he worked with a very famous sociologist that now I don't remember his name, sorry. But it will come to me maybe later. And so there is also, for example, just notebooks with annotations. And you can also see how academic research has changed so much during the decades. So he didn't have access, for example, to all the books, and he just copied part of the books in his notebooks. And so that's also fascinating to me to see. But the question about solidarity, if it's explicitly in the archive, if it's creation of my of how I presented things, no, it's really explicit. They really go for, they ask for solidarity, they ask for support. And first of all, they are very interested in solidarity from Europe and Asia, but first of all, they're interested in African solidarity. And why? Like, they really need the support of independent African countries to go on with their armed struggle. They couldn't, these political movements that were formed in the exile couldn't go back to Angola to organize, so they had to settle in neighboring countries. The first place where they go, they leave Paris in 1960, they go to Conakry, to Guinea-Conakry, because they were hosted by Sékou Touré. So they were very much in contact, also to answer to Eleni, they were very much in contact with other African intellectuals. Andrade was known to Touré, who offered the first base of the first steering committee of the MPLA was based in Conakry. And then when there was a series of uprising in Angola in 1961 that prompted Portugal to respond with an armed intervention, and that was actually when the liberation war started, the armed liberation war, and they really needed to move to a neighboring country. So they moved to what was then Congo, Leopoldville, and to Leopoldville, nowadays Kinshasa. They settled there, but as I said, the Angolan liberation context is very complex, because there was another movement that was based in Leopoldville and was that emerged in the Angolan diaspora in the Congo. And the government in Leopoldville really preferred that other movement. So then the MPLA moved to Brazzaville. They were very much in contact with Brazzaville. And then they opened, as the other countries gained independence, they opened committees, for example, in Zambia. Zambia also borders Angola. So when Zambia became independent, the MPLA could open a guerrilla front in the east. So they needed the support of these countries to engage in warfare. It was really, really crucial. And actually also the Northern African countries of the Maghreb, especially first Morocco and then Algeria, were essential for the organizing of the struggle. There was a transnational organization that put together all the liberation movements of the Portuguese colonies. It was called the CONCP, the Conference of the Nationalist Organization of the Portuguese Colonies, and it was first based in Rabat, in Morocco. But then when the king died and his son took on power, and meanwhile Algeria became independent, they moved to Algeria. And they always, they try to make their case in the African Union. It was really, African solidarity was really what they looked for in the first place. And then, of course, all the help they could get from any other state or association, like civil society, also was welcomed. I know, for example, they had like contacts in Italy. They had a committee in France that arrived. They got to the point of sending blood for transfusions, and all this kind of solidarity, happened in very disparate ways. From publications to blood to weapons and so on. And about the fact that I said he was a member of the elite, we know that it's very common that the leaders of movements come from this elite. We imagine in a context like Angola, where levels of illiteracy reached 90% in the early 1960s. So it was kind of a forced thing that it was the elite who led these movements. At the same time, it's not a justification. Of course, the many perspectives are left out of the narrative. Inclusive, we have to say the MPLA won the liberation war. They proclaimed independence, and they are still in power today after 51 years. And they have become a kind of an authoritarian regime. And they have erased for a long time from the history of the liberation war the other movements that were active, the FNLA and UNITA. They were proclaimed as also recurring to a discourse, the kind of language that was very common. They were the slaves of imperialism, and they were fantoche. And so the experience of all the people, common people who fought for independence within these other movements have been erased for years. And I would say it's been, since the civil war stopped in Angola, it just finished in 2002. So Angola has been in war from 1961 to 2002, with small brief pieces period in between, but it was like an exception state for many decades. And so it's been only in the last 2 decades that slowly they are recovering the experience of other people involved in the struggle, not only of the elite, but also, for example, there are projects of extensive oral history interviews with people that also like in African languages, because also this has to be said, many of the documents I showed are in Portuguese or in French, but many people are not even not even fluent in these European languages. Even if Portuguese, it's also as a result of the decades of war and displacement, massive displacement that has occurred in Angola. It's one of the most spoken language today in Angola is Portuguese. And Another thing that I wanted to say about he being a member of the elite is he was a member of the intellectual elite. And slowly during the Liberation War, being an intellectual became like kind of an insult because, who was praised were the people really fighting, the guerrilla men. And so you can see also the image that we have from that time. We can also the image, for example, from the publication of the Tricontinental, we can see people with their weapon, with a rifle. But the kind of work that many others did was in diplomacy. It was in intellectual connections, and this was not recognized. Really, they were not recognized as legitimately revolutionary agents, and they were purged. Actually, after independence, many intellectuals were arrested, exiled, and so on. So it is kind of a very it's an aspect of the struggle that has many faces. Like in the beginning, yes, they were the elite, then they kind of suffered from being from the elite. No, I'm not, putting. I don't want to be paternalistic, but it is kind of what happened, at least in the experience of Mário de Andrade. About poetry as a means to revolutionize political consciousness. So it is very interesting as a theme. A couple of years ago, I read on the reportage from Ukraine in the New York Times saying about how there were all these poetry nights in Kyiv now during the war. So it may be just a human response to the trauma of war, like a very quick means of expression, whereas novels are like a kind of a lengthy project. Writing a poem, it's more immediate, and it's kind of also maybe it's more immediate to write and to read. So, and then there is this aspect of performance as well. So it can be like a way to put together these kind of emotions at a time of distress and at a time of challenging conditions, circumstances. Then about the formal aspect and the literary value, this really depends on who reads and also on the judgment of time. Like this is, I don't know if it's I don't know if it's an effective form of revolutioning, but like I do believe it can bring on awareness. If it's political or other kind of awareness, it depends on the circumstances in which it is produced and received. And the last question was about transnationalism, which is a very interesting topic, in my opinion. As I tried to say in my presentation, the liberation movements from the Portuguese Union, they tried to start as a transnational movement. And then because our framework, our political framework works in nation states, they had, to participate, for example, at the UN, they had to present as a nationalist movement. To participate in the African Union, they had to appeal, they had to be nationalist to be heard. Whether, they wanted to fight commonly and collectively, but this was not this kind of representation was not accepted. There was no place for this transnational transnationalism, at least in this political institution that are fundamental to the cause, you know. So yeah, I don't know, because about I don't know if I answered this question about transnationalism, and if I left anything, please just ask again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, I'll be as brief as possible. Yes, I think organizations like BRICS, associations like BRICS, are really activated by the memory of Southern Solidarity. Of course, it's a grouping that's completely random in that it's suggested by economists that these economies are significant enough to challenge the global order, and therefore they come together. But yes, nearly all the BRICS nations in their leverage the idea of a third world, of a political project, to justify and legitimize their participation in BRICS as well as their actions outside in other parts of the third world. So yes, it's but also a lot of these countries, these emerging countries in the third world, which are now playing an important part in externalizing credit, very strongly believe in global governance reform. So, for instance, India has been talking about getting a permanent seat on the UNSC forever. And many other countries of the global south have also been agitating that it's too northern dominated. Countries like India has also been talking about reform of WHO, of WTO. That's just gone on for ages, and their proposals have changed and become more radical, but haven't really led anywhere, unfortunately. So yes, I think these groupings are very much activated by the memory of Third Worldist project. Even though they don't function as one now, they function as essentially sub-imperial formations. Because these new states are classic semi-peripheral states. They're not able to contest the global order appropriately and effectively. Knowledge production in the global south. Again, this is very tricky when you're in a situation where state universities are funded by governments that are openly towing an ethno-nationalist agenda. Knowledge production is subverted to that agenda. You can't really be very independent, at least you can't in several parts of the global south. Therefore, I think the imagination of your international imagination is limited under these circumstances. And therefore, when you talk about Southern Solidarity, as I described it before, you're talking about a neoliberal economic project where where economic nationalism is celebrated more than anything else, where your country's economic nationalism is privileged over the collective good of the global south, which wasn't how a third worldist project was supposed to function. So there you are. In terms of cultural formations and knowledge production, yes, we're seeing increasing linkages between the global south, but unfortunately they are financed and steered by the north. So these are like trilateral partnerships which are dependent on northern funding. Yes, and they can get different teams and different nations and different interest groups in the global south to talk, but you're doing it on northern terms. And I think the financial landscape means there's very little scope for South-South partnerships in the way that could actually spearhead some kind of solidarity movements. Having said that, there are limited exchanges going on, and any kind of radical change to the imaginary of the global south to make it more effective and to make it more equal and to genuinely orchestrate an international project will probably not come from state actors, but non-state ones. And what form that'll take, we only just have to wait and see. Also, there are lots of contradictions within large global south states itself. So you've got various interest groups that have an animosity towards, say, the national elite and believe that they can't speak for their nations in the sphere of the global south. You've had that throughout, right from the beginning, throughout independence. So, for example, in Indonesia, you had the question of West Papua. You had West Papuans who believed that Indonesians couldn't possibly host Bandung because they were, while they had gotten independence recently, they were also in the act of colonizing another part of their own country, which was essentially West Papua. So they protested. In India, you had Indian Dalits. Dalits generally, Dalit translates into oppressed. It's a section of society which is at the bottom of the caste system, and they've always agitated that they were in a better position to perform African solidarity simply because there were more connections between them, simply because the Afro-American struggle in America inspired the political representation projects for Dalit solidarity in India. So you've got all these contradictions within the global south itself, and what form it might take and what form might be successful is really at this stage is unknown, is unimaginable even.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you. It was very interesting because it was very unusual for us to get to hear this kind of research. So it opened up new ways to think of our imaginaries right now, more Western-centric. For example, now the discussion in the EU is how we're going to imagine ourselves without the United States. So thank you very much, both of you. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending this year's webinar. I wish you the best. See you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.